Adonai.
But most scholars say that the Hyksos and the Israelites cannot be equated because the Hyksos left Egypt hundreds of years before Moses was born. These scholars also say that the chronology of ancient Egypt cannot be tampered with.
You can play with Egyptian dates. You can move them up maybe 10 years and down 10 years, but you can't move them up and down 50 or 100 years. That's not possible. And yet many people try to do that. They try to adjust chronology to fit their predetermined notion of biblical history. You can't do it.
But maybe we have to. What if scholars are placing the Exodus in the wrong time period? Imagine the confusion if in the future scholars date World War II to the 1990s. You'll never find any evidence that it actually happened. Currently, most scholars date the Exodus to 1270 BCE during the reign of Pharaoh Ramses II. But some scholars are now breaking with that consensus.
The Bible gives information that would put the Exodus about 480 years before the early years of Solomon, in the middle of the 15th century BC.
Professor Bimson's calculations move the Exodus from its present date to 1470 BCE, less than 100 years from the traditional date for the Hyksos expulsion. These are too close to write off as a coincidence. So we have a new date for the Exodus, approximately 1500 BCE.
The Hyksos. And the Hyksos expulsion is what we're talking about when we are talking about the Exodus.
All right. Our new date for the Exodus is 1500 BCE. And we know from the Bible that the Israelites arrived in Egypt some 200 years before their Exodus. In the original Hebrew, the Bible calls the Israelites God's people, or Amo Israel. If we write about our dates, there should be hard archaeological evidence for the arrival of these Amo around 1700 BCE. "400 kilometers south of Avaris is the tomb at Beni Hassan. It dates to 1700 BCE. Because no one has looked for evidence of the Exodus in this period, the tomb has never been linked to the biblical story. And yet, there is a perfectly preserved wall painting here that records an ancient migration into Egypt from the area of modern Israel. As in the Bible, the scene involves bearded Semites riding donkeys and bringing their families and flocks into Egypt. Like the biblical Israelites, they are wearing multicolored tunics. The hieroglyphic inscription on this wall calls these people the Amo, God's people. Looking in the right place, during the right time, we are the first to recognize a veritable snapshot of the migration of the biblical Israelites to Egypt. The Bible records that at the time of their arrival, one Israelite rose to the highest levels of Egyptian power. His name was Joseph, son of Yaakov, Jacob in English. And he became so powerful that he wore on his finger the seal of royal authority. Discovering Joseph's seal at Avaris would prove that the Israelites arrived here exactly when our timeline predicts. That would be like finding a needle in a 3,700-year-old archaeological haystack. Incredibly, the tiny seal was found, precisely at the archaeological layer we anticipated. In fact, Professor Manfred Bitak found no less than 9 seals worn by Joseph's court officials. Inscribed right on them is the name Yaakov, Joseph's father.
It's very strange that we found 9 seals with the name Jakob here. It's a biblical name, by the way. The original was probably mounted on a ring worn on the finger, and this gives us a new puzzle.
Is it really a puzzle? Not if one uses our chronology. This is the only time that a Hebrew name appears on an Egyptian royal seal. It directly connects Avaris with the Bible. But Professor Bitak steers clear of biblical chronology. He's under the constant watch of the Egyptian Antiquities Authority, who have made Avaris off limits to the public. Supposedly for conservation reasons, Professor Bitak has been forced to cover up his dig every single year. The area is then plowed, seeded, and cultivated by local farmers. No one would suspect that underneath these fields lies an archaeological treasure trove that proves the biblical Exodus. Now that we found hard evidence for the arrival of the Israelites in Egypt and their rise to power, we went searching for archaeological proof of their downfall and the slavery that led to the Exodus. In search of the evidence, we had to travel to a place called Serabit El Khadem, 400 kilometers south of the Nile Delta into the Sinai Desert. For thousands of years, Egyptians mined turquoise in this area. Often they used slave labor. The ancient turquoise mines are off the beaten tourist track. The only ones who know their way in this area are the Bedouins, who still live at the foot of the mines.
I heard once that the Bedouin, they can do like the Prophet Musa, that they know which rocks have water in them, they break it. Is that true?
We got here, paid our respects to the local sheikh, and recruited one of his sons to show us the way.
Okay, let's go.
We learned of this place from old papers published in obscure journals. We came here to find proof of the slaves that Moses led to freedom. But even if we found evidence for the presence of slaves, how could we be sure that they were Israelites? The Bible provides us with 2 clues. First, the followers of Moses did not use hieroglyphic writing like the Egyptians. Rather, the biblical tradition states that they used an early form of alphabetic writing. Also, the Israelites did not worship Egyptian gods, but a single God that the Bible calls El. To support our new biblical timeline, we needed to find alphabetic inscriptions carved by slaves some 3,500 years ago. In our wildest dreams, they would also mention the biblical god, El. And sure enough, there are slave inscriptions here, and one of them records a 3,500-year-old cry. El, save me. This is the writing of a slave who worked in this mine. You can still see the chisel marks, which were part of the forced labor that the author of this inscription was involved in. And he wrote his cry to God, saying, help me, don't forget me, here where he worked and he slept and he probably died. And it represents an incredible moment in human history. Not only is it the first inscription that records the name of God, El, but it also records the oldest, or maybe the second oldest, alphabetic inscription. It's the basis on which Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, English, Arabic, all is based on this writing. Pretty incredible that after all these years we would be here to record this man's cry. Yachmos' stela, Beni Hassan tomb paintings, Joseph's royal seal, and the Israelite slavery inscriptions all point to approximately 1500 BCE as the date for Moses and the Exodus. If our date is correct, then there's something else that we have to factor in. Around 1500 BCE, people living along the Mediterranean experienced one of the most cataclysmic events in history, the eruption of the Santorini volcano in modern Greece. This eruption may be another crucial clue for decoding the biblical Exodus. This is the island of Santorini, 700 kilometers from the Egyptian coast across the Mediterranean. It is literally the mouth of a volcano. Some 3,500 years ago, Santorini was destroyed by one of the worst volcanic eruptions in human history. When it erupted, the volcano essentially brought to an end the Minoan civilization that once flourished here. It sent an ash cloud that measured some 40 kilometers straight up and 200 kilometers across. The sound of the eruption circled the Earth some 10 to 12 times.
To put this in perspective, an eruption like Santorini would be hundreds to thousands of times stronger, more explosive than the atom bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. The energy of that eruption was so immense, you would have had these huge explosions that were happening, and you'd hear crack, crack, crack. For hundreds of kilometers, people around were listening to it. We were getting earthquakes, probably magnitude 3, 4, maybe even 5 or higher, that were happening extremely rapidly. And it would have been, I'm sure, to the people living there as if the world was coming to an end.
So perhaps the cataclysmic events described in the Bible, such as plagues, darkness, and the parting of a sea, are somehow connected to the Santorini eruption. But like all things related to the Exodus, dating the Santorini eruption to 1500 BCE can be controversial.
People have been arguing about the dates of Santorini. Volcanologists and geologists would date the eruption in the 1600s BC. Archaeologists tend to date it in the 1500s BC.
Digging at Avaris, Professor Bitak has no doubt that he can pinpoint the Santorini eruption to the exact time period where we placed the Exodus.
Here, pumice from the Santorini eruption appears for the first time. So from archaeological point of view, it looks very much as if the eruption happened early in the 18th dynasty, let us say around 1500 BC.
Yakubovich's chronology machine has now synchronized a pharaoh named Ahmose, the Hyksos expulsion, the Exodus, and the Santorini eruption. It appears that the Exodus code has finally been cracked. If Yakubovich is right, we can now explain the science underlying the biblical story. We can even explain what caused the greatest miracle of them all, the parting of the Red Sea. We can then trace the biblical map and discover the real Mount Sinai, where the Exodus story came to a climax, when Moses received the 10 Commandments and placed them in the now lost Ark of the Covenant.
Let's begin with the plagues, the biblical catastrophes that struck Egypt because Pharaoh wouldn't let the Israelite slaves go. Until now, no one has come up with a comprehensive scientific explanation for all 10 plagues. The answer began to take shape for us after we returned to the Ahmose Stela and discovered an amazing synchronicity with the biblical text. The Bible says that the God of Israel passed judgment on the gods of Egypt. And the stela confirms that the statues of the gods of Egypt were toppled to the ground. Earthquakes are known to accompany volcanic eruptions like Santorini. It seems that the stela and the Bible are describing the results of an earthquake, or more precisely, what scientists now call an earthquake storm.
Earthquake storms are sequences of large earthquakes that sweep across large areas. And the best examples are the Eastern Mediterranean, where we have long historical and archaeological records.
As it turns out, the biblical story takes place in an earthquake zone. The Nile Delta, where the Bible says the Exodus took place, is crisscrossed by fault lines. To the east, the Great Rift Fault separating the Asian and African plates runs through the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, and the Red Sea, all the way to Africa. In addition, there is a fault line that runs along the modern Suez Canal and another fault line that runs along the Nile Delta under ancient Avaris. Meanwhile, some 700 kilometers to the west, the rift between the African plate and the European plate runs practically under Santorini. But what do earthquakes have to do with the biblical plagues? Well, let's begin with the first plague. Earthquakes can't possibly explain how Moses turned the Nile's waters into blood.